Chapter 1, An Unexpected Encounter. It was a sunny day, with soft rays of light illuminating every detail of the world around her, creating an atmosphere of calm and harmony. Catherine sat in a small cafe by the window, sipping her tea and admiring the view of the quiet street, where passers-by were leisurely strolling under the bright sky. Time seemed to slow down, and nothing hinted at the surprising events that would soon unfold. She absent-mindedly watched people passing by, her thoughts drifting, when the waiter approached her table with her order. Deciding to stretch her legs, Catherine stood up. Just as she was walking towards the restroom, a boy about 15 years old appeared in the corridor. As she crossed his path, they accidentally bumped into each other. At that moment, she thought about how often such little accidents can turn into significant events in life. "Oops, sorry," she quickly said, trying to apologize and avoid disrupting the peaceful moment. The boy nodded, offering a brief smile, before continuing on his way. Catherine took a few steps to the side when she glanced up and saw the man accompanying him. Her heart skipped a beat. It was him. Michel, her ex-husband, whom she hadn't seen in 15 years since their divorce. The encounter was completely unexpected, and she didn't know how to react. For a moment, it felt as though the world had frozen. She stood there in shock, unsure how to proceed. Time had passed, and both of them had changed, but for a split second, she saw him exactly as he was in her memories, the man she once loved, and the man who had left her behind. Michel too was frozen for a moment, his face changing as recognition dawned on him. He stared at her in disbelief, unsure of what to say, as memories flooded back. It had been so many years, and he never expected to run into Catherine in a cafe, of all places. But here she was, standing before him. "Catherine, is it really you?" he asked, his voice filled with surprise, yet lacking any warmth. His expression was a mixture of disbelief and reluctance. The years seemed to vanish, but the emotions they once shared didn't come rushing back. Instead, there was a cool detachment between them. Catherine felt a mix of confusion and unease. She hadn't expected to see him again, but here he was, standing in front of her. The moment she saw him, old wounds reopened, and yet, in some strange way, she also felt a sense of calm. She had long since healed, but there was something about this encounter that brought back the weight of their past. She tried to keep her composure, pushing down any unwanted emotions. "Michel," she said quietly, her voice steady, though her heart was racing. She forced a smile, trying to sound casual. "It's been a long time." Michel's response was slow, and his expression remained guarded. He hesitated, looking her over, perhaps trying to gauge how much time had passed between them, how much they had changed. "How are you? Still alone?" he asked, his tone colder than she expected. He spoke with a strange arrogance, as though he had all the right to ask her about her life. His eyes flicked over to the boy who had been walking with him, and for a moment, he seemed to want to point out how much his own life had moved forward. "This is my son, Austin," Michel said proudly, as if to assert some form of superiority. "He's a genius, just like my new wife, Sophie," he added, nodding toward a woman sitting at a nearby table. He smiled at his new family, as if his words were meant to show off his success. Catherine was taken aback. She had imagined this moment countless times in her head, but never like this. She thought she had moved on from the hurt and bitterness, but seeing Michel act the same way, as arrogant and self-assured as ever, she realized nothing had changed. Her hopes for any sort of meaningful conversation seemed distant. "Nice to see you," Catherine said with forced politeness, though she couldn't conceal the disbelief in her voice. She wasn't sure what to make of this encounter. As they exchanged pleasantries, a tall, caring young man approached Catherine. Seeing the discomfort on her face, the boy, with protective concern, asked, "Is everything okay?" Catherine smiled warmly at the sight of her son and replied, "Of course, my dear. I just bumped into an old acquaintance." She affectionately kissed Nathan on the cheek, grateful for the comfort he offered in that brief moment. Catherine turned to Michel, smiling faintly. "I'd like to introduce you to my son, Michel," she said, watching the surprise flood his face. "This is Nathan," she continued, noticing how Michel's expression shifted as he processed the new revelation. His eyes widened as he tried to make sense of it all. A whirlwind of thoughts seemed to race through his mind. Could it be true? For a moment, Michel could not speak. His mind reeled as he tried to comprehend the scene unfolding before him. A son, grown up, and clearly loved and cared for by Catherine. But how? Could Nathan be his son? Was it possible that Catherine had hidden this from him? And why would she do that? His mind raced, but before he could voice his questions, the waiter arrived with Catherine's lunch, interrupting the encounter. "Well, I'll leave you to it, Catherine said, stepping back, giving him no chance to ask further questions. She excused herself, walking away with Nathan, who was already beginning to sense the tension in the air. Michel stood there, frozen, lost in thought. What had just happened? His mind refused to accept what he had just learned. For a brief moment, his entire understanding of his past, of his relationship with Catherine, shifted. Could it be possible that Nathan was his son? But if he was, why didn't Catherine ever tell him? As Catherine and Nathan sat down, enjoying their meal, Michel returned to his own table, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Sophie and Austin noticed the distant look on his face. He seemed lost in his mind, unable to focus on the present moment. Sophie tried to engage him, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Nathan and what he had just discovered. Could Nathan really be his son? And if he was, why hadn't Catherine told him all those years ago? Michel's questions hung in the air, unanswered. His thoughts, clouded with uncertainty and doubt, took over his mind, pushing aside everything else. And as he tried to come to terms with what he had learned, his anxiety only deepened. This encounter had only raised more questions, more mysteries. Would he ever find the answers he sought? Or was the truth something better left buried in the past? Chapter 2: False Accusations and Divorce. After the encounter at the cafe, Michel returned to his table with Sophie and Austin, but his thoughts remained consumed by what had just transpired. Catherine, her words, and most of all, her son, Nathan, kept swirling in his mind. He had come here expecting a casual encounter, maybe even a polite exchange of words, but nothing had prepared him for this. How was it possible that Catherine had a son, a 15-year-old boy? And why had she kept it a secret from him all these years? Michel sat there, barely paying attention to what Sophie and Austin were saying. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the moment when he first saw Nathan, trying to piece everything together. He couldn't understand. He had been so sure that the problem all those years ago was Catherine's infertility, the reason they couldn't have children. After all, it had never occurred to him that he might be the one with the issue. The possibility that Nathan was his son made no sense. Michel had never questioned his own ability to father a child, until that time with Catherine. He came from a large family, where everything was fertile and healthy, so he assumed that if there was a problem, it must be with her. They had tried for years to conceive, and every attempt had been in vain. And despite Catherine's insistence that they should see a doctor to figure out the cause of their infertility, Michel had refused. His pride, rooted in his own family's history, made him reject any possibility that he might be the one at fault. He was sure the issue lay with her, and that belief had only deepened as time passed. They had fought bitterly over the years, with Michel becoming more resentful, his accusations growing harsher. The blame was always placed on Catherine. He refused to even consider that there could be another reason for their failure to conceive. His pride and stubbornness had built an invisible wall between them, and it wasn't long before that wall led to their inevitable divorce. Catherine, though devastated at the end of their marriage, moved forward in her life. Michel, however, never fully understood the impact of his actions, and he never questioned whether his accusations were truly justified. As he sat at the table with Sophie and Austin, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He had been so certain of Catherine's infertility that it hadn't occurred to him that he might be wrong. But now, everything had changed. The encounter with her son had sparked a deep unease in him, and he couldn't let it go. Sophie, who had been talking to Michel about their plans for the weekend, stopped mid-sentence when she saw his distant gaze. She had known him long enough to recognize when something was bothering him, and this time, it was clear. He wasn't present in the conversation, and she could see it was something serious. Her concern grew as Michel's thoughts wandered back to the past, to the life he shared with Catherine. "Michel, what's wrong? You're acting strange," Sophie asked, her voice filled with concern. "Is something bothering you?" Michel snapped back to reality, but it took him a few moments to gather his thoughts. His gaze shifted to Sophie, and then to Austin, who was quietly enjoying his meal. I don't know," he said, his voice strained. "I just can't stop thinking about Catherine. And her son. Nathan." Sophie, who was used to Michel's occasional mood swings, wasn't sure how to respond. She had never fully understood the depth of his past relationship with Catherine, but she had always suspected that it still haunted him. However, this sudden fixation on the past was unsettling, and she didn't know what to make of it. "Why does it bother you so much?" Sophie asked. "It's been so many years. You've moved on, we've built a life together." Michel remained silent, his thoughts still swirling. He had moved on, yes, but there were too many unanswered questions now. Seeing Nathan had stirred something deep within him, something that made him question everything he had once believed about himself, about Catherine, And about their relationship. The idea that Nathan could be his son felt like a storm that wouldn't stop raging in his mind. That night, Michel could barely sleep. His mind kept returning to the thought that Nathan might be his son. How had this happened? If Catherine had indeed hidden this from him, why had she done so? And what about his own fertility? He had always assumed that it was Catherine who was the problem, but now he was left wondering if the problem lay with him all along. The next day, Michel could no longer push the questions aside. He felt an urgent need to know the truth. He couldn't live with the uncertainty, not when it involved something as crucial as his own son, or what he had always believed to be his son. His pride, which had once caused so much damage, had now given way to an overwhelming desire to find answers. He made a decision. He would go to a doctor and get a fertility test. He needed to know once and for all what was wrong with him. The thought of facing this truth was terrifying, but he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that it was something he needed to confront. He had to know if he had been wrong all those years ago. If he was sterile, it would explain everything, including why Catherine had never had children with him. But if he wasn't, then the only conclusion he could draw was that Nathan might be his son after all. As he made the appointment for the test, Michel's mind was in turmoil. Part of him hoped the test would show that he was sterile, that it had been his fault all along. But another part of him feared the possibility that Nathan really was his son, and if that were the case, it would change everything. Sophie, unaware of Michel's plans, continued with their daily life. She noticed his odd behavior, but she had no idea what he was preparing to do. She just wanted him to stop dwelling on the past and focus on their future. Little did she know that Michel was about to uncover a truth that would shatter the foundation of their relationship. Chapter 3: Strange Discoveries. Several days passed before Michel finally received the results of his fertility test. He could hardly bear the anticipation, but when the results arrived, they were not as he had hoped. Despite his initial relief at the idea that perhaps he would have some answers, the truth was harder to accept than he imagined. When he returned home that evening, Sophie immediately noticed his distant demeanor. She was used to him having moments of quiet reflection, but this time, something seemed different. Michel's usual air of confidence was gone, replaced with something much more unsettling. His shoulders were slumped, his brow furrowed. He looked like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, a burden he could no longer bear alone. "Michel, what's going on? You look off. Is something wrong?" Sophie asked gently, her voice tinged with concern. Michel didn't immediately respond. His gaze was fixed on the floor, and his mind seemed to be a million miles away. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost unrecognizable, hoarse and tired. "Sophie. The test," he began, his words weighed down by their heaviness. "It was negative. I'm sterile." Sophie's face fell as the shock settled in. Her heart raced in her chest, and she struggled to find words. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. All these years, she had known Michel had been hiding something: his occasional lack of confidence, his reluctance to fully embrace fatherhood, his distance when the topic of children came up. But hearing him say this, out loud, was something she never expected. "Michel. But how?" she whispered, taking a step back. She struggled to keep her composure, but the news hit her like a blow to the stomach. She had always suspected there was something hidden, but the truth was far more painful than she imagined. He looked at her with regret in his eyes. He could see the shock and confusion on her face, but there was nothing he could do to undo the years of denial, the years of avoiding the truth. Michel had always assumed he was healthy, that the problem must have been with Catherine. But now, faced with this revelation, he was forced to confront the possibility that he had been wrong all along. "I don't know what to do with this," Michel continued. "All these years, I thought it was Catherine. But now I have no idea what to believe. Was it always me? Was I the one who couldn't give us the future we wanted? I've wasted so much time." Sophie stood silently, absorbing his words. She didn't know what to say, or if there was anything to say. The tension between them had been growing for months, and now it seemed as if the floodgates were opening, exposing the cracks in their relationship that they had both been avoiding. Sophie tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. "Michel, you can't keep doing this to yourself. We need to move on. The past is the past. We have to look forward, not back." But Michel couldn't hear her. His mind was spinning, still reeling from the news. He was left with so many questions, so many doubts. The idea that his infertility had been the root cause of his issues with Catherine, that it had been him all along, was too much for him to handle. It felt like his entire identity, everything he thought he knew about himself, had been shattered in an instant. "I don't know what to do with this new reality," he murmured. I can't stop thinking about Nathan. Could he really be mine? Was Catherine hiding the truth from me all these years? Sophie froze. She had known Michelle was still holding on to questions about Catherine, but she hadn't realized the extent of it until now. She had hoped that time would heal all wounds, but Michelle's obsession with the past was only getting worse. He seemed consumed by it, unable to let go. You have to let it go, Michelle, Sophie said, her voice filled with both frustration and sadness. You can't keep dwelling on it. You have us now. You have me and Austin. You need to accept that your past with Catherine is over. We can't move forward if you keep looking behind. But Michelle wasn't ready to let go. His curiosity, his desire for answers, was too strong. He couldn't rest until he knew the truth. The pain of not knowing, of feeling as though something vital had been kept from him for all these years, gnawed at him. I need to know for sure, he said, his voice shaking slightly. I need to know if Nathan is my son. I need to know if Catherine kept this from me all this time. I can't live with a doubt. If she never told me the truth, I need to understand why. Sophie's eyes widened in disbelief. Michelle, do you really think this is the answer to everything? You can't go digging into the past like this. It will only cause more pain, for both you and for me. Let it go. Let it stay in the past. But Michelle was determined. No, I need the truth. If I don't get it, I'll never be able to move on. That night, Michelle lay awake, his mind racing with thoughts and questions he couldn't escape. The fear of confronting the truth, of potentially unraveling everything he had built with Sophie, held him captive. Yet, the desire to understand what had happened, to piece together the broken parts of his life, was too powerful to ignore. The next day, Michelle decided to take matters into his own hands. He would meet with Catherine again. He had to know the truth. If she wouldn't tell him, he would find another way. The days following Michelle's appointment were filled with tension. He moved through his routines in a daze, unable to shake off the nagging thoughts that consumed him. His mind, once certain and confident, now seemed to drift in a sea of uncertainty. The moment he had spent with Catherine, seeing Nathan, her son, had been the spark that ignited a fire of doubt within him. He could not let it go. At night, when the house was quiet and the world outside seemed still, Michelle would lie awake, replaying that brief exchange over and over in his mind. He had thought he knew everything. He had believed, with a sort of stubborn pride, that it was Catherine who was incapable of bearing children. And yet now, looking back at his own life, at the long years spent accusing her, he couldn't help but wonder if he had been wrong all along. It was a painful thought, almost unbearable. To realize that for years he had lived under the shadow of a false belief, one that had shaped the course of his life. His marriage to Catherine had been tainted by these unspoken accusations, and the damage had been deep, irreparable. He had assumed that his own family's history was enough to explain everything, but now he saw it in a different light. Sophie noticed Michelle's growing distance, but she didn't know how to bridge the gap that was widening between them. They had built a life together, or so she had thought. Michelle had been her rock, but now, it seemed, his foundation was crumbling. She tried to approach him, but each time, he withdrew. It was as though a part of him had become unreachable. She couldn't understand why this was happening, why the past was suddenly so present for him. It wasn't long before Michelle's preoccupation turned into something more. His thoughts were no longer just vague memories of a lost past, they were now questions, sharp and demanding answers. He had to know the truth. He could no longer go on living in this fog of uncertainty, wondering if Nathan might be his son. His pride, which had once kept him from seeking help, now pushed him toward a decision that would change everything. Sophie, noticing his restless nights and the growing tension in his eyes, finally asked, "Michelle, what's really going on? You've been lost in thought for days. I can feel it, you're slipping away from me." Her voice was filled with concern, but also something deeper, something unspoken that hovered between them. Michelle turned to her, and for the first time in days, he met her gaze fully. "I've scheduled a fertility test," he confessed, his voice heavy with the weight of his own realization. "I need to know the truth. If I've been wrong all these years, if it's me who's the problem, then I have to face it." Sophie felt her stomach twist. The words she had feared had finally been spoken aloud. She wanted to understand, to support him, but at that moment, she didn't know how. She had always believed that their life together was unshakable. They had built something real, something steady. But now Michelle's doubts seemed to be shaking everything they had. She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Michelle," she said softly, "you're not the problem. You're not the one to blame. We've been through so much together. Why does this question have to tear us apart now?" Michelle looked at her, the weight of his confusion pressing down on him. He didn't know how to answer her. He wanted to tell her that this wasn't about blame, but about understanding, about finally uncovering the truth that had haunted him for so long. But the words didn't come easily. It was as if he was speaking not just about the test, but about all the years he had spent in ignorance, all the ways his pride had kept him from truly seeing his own life. "I don't know," he admitted. I need to know. I need to understand why I was so certain of everything, only to be confronted with the possibility that I've been living a lie." Sophie sat in silence, absorbing the gravity of what Michelle had just revealed. She wanted to hold him, to reassure him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him had shifted permanently. The man she had known, the man she had married, was no longer the same. And as much as she loved him, she wondered if the man who had once been so certain of himself would ever come back. The days that followed were filled with an uncomfortable stillness. Michelle's test loomed over them, an invisible presence that seemed to take up more space than either of them could have imagined. And though Sophie tried to distract herself with daily life, the uncertainty gnawed at her. Michel, for his part, couldn't stop thinking about the possible outcomes. What if the test confirmed his fears? What if the truth was more complicated than he could have ever imagined? He found himself oscillating between hope and dread, each emotion pushing him further into a state of paralysis. The results would come soon, and they would answer everything, or perhaps nothing at all. Chapter 4, Revelations and Uncomfortable Truths. A few days later, Michel received the results of his fertility test. When he walked into the house, the weight of the papers in his hands felt heavier than anything else. He could already feel the tension building inside him, the anticipation that had been gnawing at him for days now at its peak. His heart raced as he made his way to the kitchen, where Sophie was preparing dinner. She glanced up, noticing his serious expression immediately. "Michel," she said softly, setting the knife down on the counter. "What's wrong?" He didn't respond right away. Instead, he stood there, holding the envelope, staring at it as though it held the answers to everything that had been haunting him for so long. His silence made Sophie uneasy. She had never seen him like this, so distant, so torn. The anxiety that had been building between them was palpable. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice quiet but laden with the weight of what he had just learned. "The test confirmed my worst fear," Michel said. "I'm sterile. I've been infertile this whole time." Sophie froze. Her mind raced, trying to process his words. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The world outside their small kitchen faded into the background as Sophie tried to understand the enormity of what Michel had just shared with her. I don't understand," Sophie finally said, her voice trembling. I thought we already knew it was Catherine. She was the one who couldn't have children, wasn't she?" Michel lowered the envelope, his gaze drifting to the floor as he nodded slowly. "I always thought that too. But it turns out it wasn't her. It was me. All these years, I was blaming her. I was too proud to see the truth." The silence in the room was deafening. Sophie stood motionless, her mind reeling. This was a truth she had never expected, and it shattered her understanding of everything that had come before. It explained so much, yet it also raised even more questions. Michel's revelation made everything more complicated than ever. "How could you not know?" Sophie finally asked, her voice a mixture of hurt and disbelief. "How could you live with this and never find out?" Michel exhaled slowly, as though releasing all the pent-up guilt he had carried for years. "I was too proud. Too stubborn to accept that something could be wrong with me. I didn't want to face it, so I blamed Catherine. And when we got divorced, I kept going on like nothing had happened. But now..." His voice faltered as the weight of the situation overwhelmed him. "Now it's all coming back. Everything I thought I knew, everything I believed about myself, it's all been a lie." Sophie's heart ached as she watched him. She could see the pain in his eyes, but she also saw the deep regret that now consumed him. She had never expected this, never imagined that Michel, the man she had married, could have been so wrong all those years. "What are we supposed to do now?" Sophie asked quietly, almost to herself. "What does this mean for us?" Michel didn't have an answer. He wasn't even sure if he had one for himself. All the pieces of his life, his marriage to Sophie, his past with Catherine, now felt jumbled and incomplete. He had spent so much time trying to build a perfect life, only to realize that everything he thought was true had been built on a foundation of false assumptions. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Sophie's mind was filled with conflicting emotions. She wanted to comfort Michel, to tell him that everything would be okay, but she couldn't shake the fear that this revelation had irrevocably changed their relationship. She could feel the distance between them growing with each passing second. Michel, too, was lost in his thoughts. The truth about his infertility had forced him to confront everything he had buried inside himself. He had always prided himself on being strong, on being able to handle any challenge life threw at him. But this was different. This was something he couldn't control, and it was a reality he couldn't escape. The truth had shattered everything. After a long, heavy silence, Michel finally spoke again, his voice quiet and uncertain. "I need to know more. I need to understand how all of this happened. I can't live with this uncertainty anymore. But I don't know how to face Catherine now. I don't know how to deal with everything that's happened." Sophie didn't know what to say. She had hoped Michel would find peace with the truth, but instead, it seemed to have made everything more complicated. His determination to get answers, to dig deeper into his past, filled her with a sense of dread. She had wanted them to move forward, but Michel's fixation on the past seemed to pull him further away from her. "I don't think this will fix anything," Sophie said softly, her voice filled with resignation. "Even if you find the answers, it won't change what's happened. We can't go back, Michel. We have to deal with what's here, now." Michel's mind was too clouded with doubts to listen to Sophie's words. He couldn't stop himself from thinking about the possibility that Nathan could be his son, that Catherine had kept this secret from him. He needed closure, he needed the truth, even if it meant facing the most painful part of his life. "I have to speak to her," Michel said, his voice firm. "I have to confront Catherine. I can't live with this anymore." Sophie knew this moment was inevitable. She could see the resolve in Michel's eyes, and she knew he was already lost in the idea of uncovering the truth, no matter the cost. She tried to reason with him, but deep down, she knew that this was something he had to do for himself. "I'll go with you," Sophie said, her voice quieter now. "But I can't promise that it will make anything easier. You're not the only one who's been living with this. Catherine, too, has her own truths to deal with." Michel nodded, though the uncertainty remained in his heart. He didn't know what the future held, but he couldn't turn back now. The questions that had plagued him for so long were finally coming to the surface, and he had no choice but to face them head on. Chapter 5: New Reality and Profound Changes. The following days were filled with a growing sense of inevitability for Michel. Sophie's words echoed in his mind as he wrestled with his need for answers. Even though she had tried to warn him, to make him understand that knowing the truth wouldn't change the past, Michel couldn't let it go. He had made up his mind, he would confront Catherine, no matter the consequences. The unsettling feeling that had grown in him over the years, the nagging uncertainty about Nathan, could no longer be ignored. But in the days leading up to the meeting, Michel found himself increasingly distant, not just from Sophie, but from everything. He tried to maintain normalcy, but the weight of what he had learned, what he was about to uncover, had taken hold of him completely. He couldn't stop thinking about Nathan. The boy's face, his likeness to some of the features Michel once saw in himself, haunted his every thought. Was Nathan his son? Was it possible that Catherine had kept this from him all this time? Sophie, too, was struggling with the situation. She had hoped that Michel would find peace after the revelation of his infertility. But instead of the relief she thought would come, she watched him spiral further into his obsession with the past. She had agreed to go with him when he decided to meet Catherine, but the closer the day came, the more uneasy she felt. She wasn't sure what she was hoping for, but she feared the outcome would bring them no closer to the life they had once dreamed of. On the day of the meeting, Michel's anxiety was palpable. He had reached out to Catherine, asking to meet her, and to his surprise, she had agreed. The request was blunt, and he felt a strange sense of anticipation mixed with dread as the time to face her drew near. Sophie had tried to prepare him, to remind him that the past was behind them, but Michel couldn't listen. He needed closure. He needed to understand how everything had gone so wrong, how he had lived so many years under the illusion of his own certainty, only to find himself in this tangled mess of unanswered questions. As they arrived at the cafe where they were to meet, Michel could feel the weight of the moment settling over him. He had no idea what to expect from Catherine. He hadn't seen her in so many years, and their last conversation had been full of bitterness, accusations, and hurt. But now, the stakes were different. Now, it was about the truth, about the child he had always been kept in the dark about. When Catherine arrived, she seemed calm, almost serene, as if she had already made peace with everything that had happened. But Michel noticed the brief flicker of surprise in her eyes as she saw him and Sophie. The years had passed, but the tension between them was as strong as ever. The years of silence, of resentment, had not erased the history between them, and now it would have to be confronted head-on. "Michel," Catherine said, her voice carefully neutral. "It's been a long time. What is it you wanted to talk about?" Michel hesitated for a moment before speaking, his voice tight with emotion. "I need to know the truth," Catherine. I need to know if Nathan is my son. Catherine's eyes widened in surprise, and for a split second, Michelle saw something in her eyes that made his stomach churn. Was it guilt? Fear? It was hard to tell. But before he could analyze it further, she responded. No, Michelle, she said, her tone firm. Nathan is not your son. Michelle's heart sank. The word stung, but he wasn't sure what he expected. He had prepared himself for this answer, yet hearing it aloud somehow made it more painful than he could have imagined. I don't understand, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You were pregnant when we separated. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you say anything? Catherine sighed, the weight of her own past apparent in her expression. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to bring you back into my life. After everything that happened between us, I couldn't let you be a part of Nathan's life. I didn't want to hurt you, Michelle, but I also didn't want to drag you into a situation that wasn't your responsibility. Michelle felt as though the ground was slipping beneath him. His mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of information Catherine had just given him. The confusion, the anger, the hurt, it all came rushing back. If Nathan is not my son, then who is? Michelle asked, struggling to maintain his composure. Catherine's face softened for a moment, and she looked down at the table. Nathan is Gregory's son, she said quietly, her voice tinged with something that sounded like regret. After we separated, I went to a doctor. I found out I was perfectly healthy and capable of having children. Gregory and I got married soon after, and I was pregnant with Nathan shortly thereafter. Michelle's heart skipped a beat. Gregory? He had no idea who this man was, and the thought that Catherine had moved on so quickly after their divorce cut deep. You have 2 other sons, don't you? Michelle asked, his voice hoarse. Evan and Theo? Catherine nodded. Yes. After Nathan, I had 2 more children with Gregory. We've built a life together, Michelle. And despite what happened between us, I've moved on. I've created a family that I'm proud of. Michelle sat back in his chair, his mind whirling. The pain of realizing that Catherine had never told him about her new family, about Nathan's true father, was almost too much to bear. All those years of anger, all those years of blaming her, had been based on nothing. And now, he had no one to blame but himself. I was wrong, Michelle whispered, more to himself than to Catherine. I've wasted so much time, holding on to grudges, holding on to lies. Catherine didn't respond immediately. She seemed to be weighing her words carefully, as if she were deciding how much of her own truth she was willing to share with him. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but firm. We both made mistakes, Michelle. We both hurt each other. But we've moved on. I've built my life, and so have you. You can't keep holding on to the past. You need to let go of all the bitterness and the pain. It won't do you any good. Michelle swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling on his shoulders. The revelation about Nathan, about his own infertility, about everything he had believed for so long, it all came crashing down on him. He wasn't sure what to do with all this information, but one thing was clear, his life would never be the same again. Chapter 6, The Aftermath. The confrontation with Catherine left Michelle feeling empty and unmoored. He had expected some kind of clarity, a sense of resolution, but instead, he felt as if his entire world had been upended. The answers he had sought for so long had come at a price he wasn't sure he was willing to pay. The days following the meeting were marked by silence between him and Sophie. Michelle had returned home with a heavy heart, and though he wanted to talk, he couldn't bring himself to speak. How could he explain everything that had just happened? How could he share the weight of his revelations with Sophie, when it was clear that the truth about Nathan and his infertility had changed everything? Sophie had hoped that the meeting with Catherine would provide some closure for Michelle. She had wanted him to find peace, to let go of the doubts that had been eating away at him for so long. But now, seeing him so distant and withdrawn, she realized that the answers they had received only complicated things further. What was meant to provide clarity had only left them more fractured than before. One night, after dinner, Sophie finally broke the silence. Michelle had been staring blankly at his plate, his mind miles away. She couldn't bear the quiet any longer. Michelle, what's going on? Sophie asked, her voice thick with concern. I thought after the meeting, we'd at least start to figure things out. But you're still so distant, so lost. Michelle met her gaze but didn't answer immediately. He opened his mouth as though he were about to speak, but the words caught in his throat. What could he possibly say? How could he explain to her that he felt like a stranger in his own life? That the truth about his infertility, about Nathan, had torn apart everything he thought he knew? I don't know, Sophie, he said finally, his voice rough. I don't know how to move forward. I thought I wanted the truth, but now that I have it, I feel shattered. I don't know who I am anymore. Sophie reached across the table, her hand brushing his. Michelle, I don't know how to fix this. But I'm still here. We're still here. We can't undo what's happened, but maybe we can rebuild something. You don't have to go through this alone. Michelle's heart twisted at her words. He could see the love and concern in her eyes, but it was as if something inside him had broken beyond repair. The man he was before this all began was gone, and he didn't know if he could ever be the same again. I don't know if I can move on from this, he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. I keep thinking about Nathan. I keep wondering if I missed out on something, a chance to be a father, a chance to have a family. And I wonder if I would have been a better man for him. I don't know how to live with the fact that I was so wrong, that I spent all these years blaming Catherine when the problem was with me. Sophie squeezed his hand, trying to offer comfort, but she couldn't erase the pain in his voice. She had always believed that Michel was a man of strength, someone who could face any challenge. But this was different. This wasn't something that could be solved with determination alone. Michel, Sophie said softly, I know you've been carrying this burden for so long, and I can't take that pain away. But maybe it's time to stop blaming yourself. You can't change the past, but you can decide how you move forward from here. Michel looked at her, his eyes filled with so much uncertainty. I don't even know where to start. Sophie sat back, her eyes scanning his face as she tried to think of the right words. She knew the journey ahead would be long and difficult, but she couldn't bear to see him so broken. She wanted to help him find his way, to remind him of the things they had built together. We start here, she said, her voice steady. We start with what we have. We take it one day at a time. You don't have to have all the answers right now, you just need to know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Michel nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. The road ahead was uncertain, but maybe, just maybe, he could begin to rebuild his life, piece by piece. The next few weeks were filled with difficult conversations and uncomfortable silences. Michel couldn't stop thinking about what he had learned. The truth about his infertility had shaken him to his core, and the revelation that Nathan wasn't his son didn't make things any easier. He felt like he had lost something, a chance at fatherhood, a piece of himself. But slowly, with Sophie's support, he began to realize that life had to move forward, even if it wasn't the life he had once imagined. One day, after weeks of reflection, Michel finally spoke to Sophie with a new sense of clarity. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, he began, his voice stronger than before. About moving forward. I've spent so much time looking back, blaming myself, trying to change things that can't be changed. I've realized that I need to stop doing that. I can't fix the past. But I can decide what to do with the future. Sophie smiled, relief washing over her. I'm proud of you, Michel. You don't have to have everything figured out right now, but I believe in you. I believe we can find a way forward, together. Michel nodded. The weight of his past was still there, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of hope. The journey wasn't over, but it was a journey he wouldn't have to face alone.
If you enjoyed this story, we'd love for you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us and motivates us to continue sharing heartwarming, inspiring stories almost every day.